Welcome to our second AEESP Education Committee webinar for the academic year of 2025 and 2026. My name is Xinyu Zhang. Together with Matt Lensman, we are the Education Committee members and your host and moderator for today. Today, we have three great panelists to present the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in Environmental Science and Engineering. What is Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? SOTO. It is a systematic reflection on teaching and learning that is disseminated publicly. It is a framework to improve and share teaching practices. It can strengthen teaching effectiveness, enhance student engagement, and inspire innovation while gaining scholarly achievements. Incorporating SOTO in environmental science and engineering education helps us reflect on teaching, build upon SOTO. We can also seek research opportunities with internal support like seed grants, service learning courses, student research scholarships, as well as some external funding opportunities such as NSF, RAFE, and Big Sur programs for a transition to engineer education research. Places to disseminate SOTO work include conferences such as Lilly Conference, ASEE conferences, AEESP education sessions, as well as journal or conference publications. Our panelists will elaborate more on this matter. From this webinar, you will gain basic knowledge and skills for SOTO from diverse examples and experience. Our three panelists will present SOTO projects, resources, and opportunities to advance SOTO to engineer education research, EER, from different perspectives as tenure faculty, non-tenure track faculty, and department head. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. Each panelist is presenting their own experiences and perspectives. We will have an open QA session at the end. Throughout their talk, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the Q&A session of the webinar. This webinar is recorded, and panelist emails will be provided during the Q&A session. Our first panelist is Professor Angela Bielefeld from the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Architecture Engineer at University of Colorado Boulder. She is also the director for their new engineer education PhD program. She is a fellow of ASEE. Her research focuses on social responsibility, engineer ethic education, sustainability education, and community engagement. She started her SOTO journey in 2002 and later grows into EER. Today, she will share her journey from SOTO to EER and present examples of both types. Welcome.
All right, so I'll get started. I think next slide. So I started at Boulder in 1996, and I was doing traditional lab-based research in environmental engineering and teaching 3 classes a year on the tenure track. And you can kind of see then a timeline, like 6 years later is when I really started doing SOTL, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And it really was generated in response to, I would say, faculty skepticism of integrating community-engaged projects. Bernard Amadei had just started Engineers Without Borders at CU Boulder, and students coming into the environmental capstone design class that I was teaching said we would like to do real projects that could help these communities as part of this class. And so that sounded like a great idea. We'd started doing it. And then other colleagues in the department were skeptical that those were rich enough or rigorous enough learning experiences for the students. So really to gather ammunition beyond my anecdotal confidence that it was working really well, that's when I started getting into gathering data to convince others that this was an appropriate learning environment. So that started in 2002. In 2006, I was on my sabbatical, and I took some time to really build skills to do engineering education research. So this included a week-long seminar, workshop. I mean, it was intense, more than 40 hours a week, to learn the methods for engineering education research. Subsequent to that, auditing some courses through our School of Education here at Boulder, and then other types of professional development. So it's a little hard to jump in if you don't know anything. So lean on others who can really teach you how to do this sort of thing. In our department, then there was a need with outcomes assessment for ABET, for someone who really knew how to do this, to bring some expertise. So when I became the director of our interdisciplinary environmental engineering program, that came with ABET automatically. And then once I was doing it, civil and architectural engineering, which are 2 additional ABET accredited degrees, said, why don't you do all of them? So I was doing ABET for 3 degrees. And I think it'll be pretty clear that when you're gathering evidence of student learning, which is something we often do for ABET, that can be congruent to some of the data you might use for scholarship of teaching and learning activities. And then eventually, again, these scholarship of teaching and learning, which is, my class, improvements that I can make locally, grew into collaborations with others, and we gathered a variety of NSF grants for that. In terms of impact on annual merit, people might ask this later, but people in my department, didn't really know what it was. So it didn't really count in any beneficial way until much later, when I figured out I have to teach my colleagues, what is this, why is it valuable, and why should it count? And up till that time, it wasn't really counting in the beginning at all. So yeah, I think that'll cover a little brief history of that. So on the next slide, this comes out of a book from the Cambridge Handbook of Engineering Education Research. And I find this really helpful when I'm talking to colleagues if they don't really know what is SOTL or what is EER. So the table is a good way in words that if you're just being an effective teacher, that's at the beginning. If you move into scholarly teaching, actually maybe some of the things in the first box people aren't even doing. So if you see that it says use accepted teaching theories, I was never taught teaching theory at all. And many of my colleagues, I think, are not familiar with teaching theory. So you might start to learn some teaching theory, but you also have evidence, and that's the assessment piece for scholarly teaching. And then the third block is when you share what you've learned with others. So either conference papers or conference publications are often your first step. You might not be ready to jump to a journal paper right away. And it's still, though, I like the cycle. So you're teaching your class, you have a question. You're like, I wonder if I could teach it better by changing what I'm doing. I wonder if, in addition to just learning content, students are motivated to learn, if they're developing engineering identity, such and so forth. So your questions come out, and then you gather evidence to answer those sorts of questions, which answers hopefully your questions. But with any good research, and SOTL is, in my mind, very similar, you get as many new questions as you answered, and so you cycle back through the process. So those of us who really have that view on our teaching, like every year I change something. And I'm either changing it to what I've observed that I think I could do better, but our students are also changing. So I've been teaching 29 years. And as you might imagine, the types of students and what they expected and what worked well 29 years ago, if I were still doing that now, it would not be working at all. So we need to be always updating our practice to stay current. Next slide. So I thought I would just gather a few suggestions, kind of overarching from, a couple decades of doing this. And the first one I have is to look at published literature. So you may not be aware that there's a large number of people who do engineering education research and scholarship of teaching and learning. And a good example would be ASEE, the American Society for Engineering Education. Each summer, their annual conference publishes over 2,000 papers for work that is being done. And in addition to that, there are local section and zone conferences that also are doing tons of work. So if you were unaware, there's a lot out there, and you shouldn't start from zero. You should see, what are other people doing in this area? What can I learn? And then build upon. So I would start there. In addition, there is a lot of related work outside of engineering specifically that could be really helpful. So DBER is the abbreviation for disciplinary-based education research. So that means it's usually at the college level, and it's in a lot of STEM disciplines. So our colleagues in physics and math, et cetera. And there's a lot of commonality with what they're doing, how they're teaching, and insights that they've gained. So looking to their work is also really helpful. And then even beyond that, I would say recently when I do literature work, I see medical school, like business schools. I wouldn't, it seemed overly restrictive, and you miss a lot of good work that's happening if you're too focused on just what's happening in engineering education. And then once you read other people's work, and you're like, well, what am I doing? What am I doing different? Why would anyone care? Sometimes your local context is unique. So something worked somewhere else. You're not sure if it'll work for you in your different local context. And then also, again, things change over time. So if the most recent publication you find is 10 or 15 years ago, who knows if it's still going to work, right? So if you can update the literature with what you've learned, that could be a contribution. So that's kind of the first thing I would recommend is get out there and read some of the literature. The second is to think about human subjects research and the ethics around studying your local context, in particular if you're going to publish those results. And so IRB is what we use as the acronym for what's called Institutional Review Board. Most universities use some variation of that. And you will propose what your study is going to be, what kinds of data you're going to collect, and then they review it, and then they get back to you. And what they want to do is ensure that you're not exploiting your positionality as the instructor of a class. Again, SOTL, we're often studying our own class, and you're the instructor. And so they want to make sure that your questions might not impact how you treat students, the grades that students are awarded, and they will help you with that and figuring out, are you doing that appropriately? So it's important to think through this to do your work ethically. Some of the interesting things locally is I've submitted things for review, and my RB actually says, well, that's just evaluation and assessment. We're not going to officially review it and give you a protocol number. So that's something to think about as to whether you're just doing, typical evaluation and assessment work. But I would highly recommend that you at least try to work with your human subjects review board, explain what you're doing, and submit it. And even if they get back to you and say, we're not going to officially review it, the fact that you've thought through that and the ethics of how you treat folks is definitely worthwhile. The third suggestion would be a really common way that we do scholarship of teaching and learning work is a pre-post change. And, that aligns with changes in what we've learned. So what you knew at the beginning, hopefully you gained toward your learning objectives for your class, and you can document that. Sometimes it's also attitudes that we care about or interests. So if you're measuring knowledge, then you probably have something like a rubric or, the percent of students that answered question correctly. For the more attitudinal things, we would often do surveys. Surveys have a lot of inherent risks. So it seems like almost every study I read, it's like, woohoo, it worked awesome. The students loved it. And that's their data. And it's like, well, let's think about that. You're giving it in your class. How many of your students want to tell you that they didn't like it, right? So think carefully about the types of survey questions you ask, what sort of biases might be in the responses. And that little text in red there says, are these validated instruments? Well, what does that mean? Others who do studies of particularly student attitudes and interests and motivations have spent often a PhD dissertation or a number of years developing what I would call a validated survey instrument. So they've looked carefully at the questions, how students interpret the question. So they might have done interviews with students. They've looked at, does that map to the educational theories that are associated with that? So that's too much work for you to do. So, but if someone else has published work with a similar research question, can you use their instrument? Yes. The answer is yes. If you were to publish it, you would obviously cite their work, but that might be a way to go versus just randomly generating some survey questions off the top of your own head, which might be more subject to some of the challenges that exist. And then the last idea would be when you think of research, we think of having controls, and in a lot of educational work, we don't have that. So at least in my own work, it's sort of gather some baseline data from how the course was, then make my change. And so that's usually in the next year or next semester. And then I have a comparison. So previous without a change, new change, what happened. But obviously there's different models there. How am I doing on time? Because I don't want to go over and take away time from the other speakers, and I haven't been keeping track. Nobody will tell me.
Sorry, I'm muting
Oh,
myself. I think you're okay. Thanks for checking
okay.
into
Well, I won't go too fast or too slow on the
No, I
next two,
think
but
this
I
is a
just
good
had,
pick.
yeah, two examples. So the first example on the next slide was what I did in capstone design. So I mentioned it briefly. I had different kinds of projects that students worked on in the class. So some of these were service learning or community engaged projects. Others were with on-campus partners. Some were competitions, like the work competition. Our local Water Environment Federation has a project that they select each year as a competition. And so I did some comparisons of different project types and how that affected student learning and motivation. And some of the methods that I used, certainly the quality of the students as evidenced by the deliverables that they did in the class. So their reports, their presentations, that was data that I was already gathering in large part for ABET, but sometimes there would be additional outcomes that I cared about that weren't ABET related. Student exit interviews, that was part of the class. So that wasn't, driven by SOTL. I was already doing that because I was in a continuous improvement cycle. Again, keep in mind that students may not be fully honest if they hate it because how comfortable are they to tell you? But luckily they're graduating out of capstone design, so it's like, bye. So that's good. Student surveys, of course. We use some of those in comparator classes in civil engineering to this environmental capstone. Also, most every school has anonymous end of semester student evaluations teaching, and those are administered by campus and fully anonymous. And if they let you add one or two of your own questions onto that, that can be really helpful information. I also did a project mentor survey, and the alumni survey I actually thought was really, really helpful. So after the students were out in the world and could reflect back on their experience, and again, you've removed any concern about positionality, then they can really tell you what they thought worked. So that was particularly useful information for that class. The other class at the other end of the spectrum is my first year intro to civil engineering class. So it's only 1 credit, and I've taught that class since 1997. So in that class, some of the SOTL work has been to integrate different topics. So sustainability, ethics, and equitable infrastructure have been different specific topic areas that I find challenging to teach, and sometimes they're challenging to assess around student learning. And in some of those cases, and I love ASAA, like it's networking. So someone else is like, oh, I'm teaching ethics too. Why don't we get together and we can study it in both of our contexts? And that really gives you interesting comparison information when you partner with others. Again, a lot of pre-post surveys. Often they're optional for extra credit with a suite of other extra credit options if students don't want to take a survey. And of course, then it's best if you can do paired comparisons, because otherwise a lot of my colleagues have this issue. At the beginning of the semester, many students might take an extra credit survey. Maybe the more conscientious students are more likely to take the survey, shall we say. But at the end of the semester, everyone's busy, they're overwhelmed. Then if it's an extra credit incentive, the students who are struggling in the class are the ones that are going to take the time. So you might actually have two different populations of students doing a pre-post survey, and then comparing that is not valid unless those are the same students. So that's a challenge. The other things I like to do, leverage assignments that are helping students to learn, and then also looking at it through the lens of helping me understand how the students are learning. So reflections, reflective writing essays, or concept maps have been two things that I've actually enjoyed from that class as evidence of student learning. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Angela. And we'll go ahead and move on to our second speaker. So our second panelist is Mackenzie Boyer, who's an assistant teaching professor at Arizona State University within the School of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment. And she's going to talk today about some subtle projects that she's done really to enhance student engagement and inspire the innovation within the classroom. So between innovating students, kind of supporting their professional growth and their career growth, and then again, getting them to be as involved and engaged as possible. So feel free to take over, Mackenzie.
All right, thank you, Matt. So what I'm going to focus on today is some lessons learned that I've had when my own courses don't work out very, very well, or there's a little bump along the way. So we always want to reflect on what we're doing and use that reflection to kind of, figure out where we're going to improve our courses. And so Matt, if you could go to the next slide. The diagram here is the way that we want to plan our new courses, where we're going to identify our desired results, our learning outcomes. Then we're going to think about what type of assessments we can use to support identifying if students have achieved those learning outcomes, exams, other types of measurement. And then we're going to be going into the planning, the learning and experiences of those instructions, the assignments, the lectures, those kinds of things that we're going to have. Now, this is the ideal approach, but what happens when number one doesn't connect to number three? Sometimes it's something in how we've designed the course that is just not connecting with the students, or we're not presenting certain information, a way that the students can understand. And sometimes it's these outside forces. So COVID has been a big one for many of us. Changes in institutional support is another one that I've seen, and I'm sure many of you guys have seen that as well. And the new one that seems to be popping up is AI and how that's kind of infiltrating its way into our courses. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of courses I have, problems that I've encountered, and how I handled that. So first course is CE 181, Social, Technological, and Sustainable Systems. This is a freshman level course. It counts for a sustainability humanities course for ASU students. So I get a lot of different majors: psychology, aerospace, teaching, business, and then of course civil and environmental engineers. And large course, my courses for this have ranged from 100 to 175 students. And there are 3 different versions of this course. I started off teaching one, and now I teach 2 of them. So I have been teaching the in-person course since spring 2020, when I started at ASU. And there's also an online course for traditional ASU students that's taught by another instructor. And then there's a third version that's a Universal Learners course, which is a large open access course. That's where Carvana and Starbucks and those types of businesses help support their employees to get a college education. So because we have these 3 different versions, I'm in the position where I can make some changes to my individual course, but I have to maintain the same lecture content, very similar types of assessments for my course, because it's being taught to a couple hundred other students in the same semester that I'm not always involved with. So I started teaching at ASU in spring 2020, which was a rough semester for all of us that were teaching that semester. I had half of a semester of a normal experience, and then COVID hit. This class moved to online, and it was a little bumpy for all of us. And then in the fall semester, because this was such a large class, ASU told me it had to be online only. So I spent a semester lecturing over Zoom to 125 black boxes of disengaged students. And then it was even worse the following semester, spring 2021, ASU told me I had to teach this as a high flex class, which is essentially choose your own adventure. So I had students on Zoom and I had students in the classroom, and I needed to, accommodate all of them all at once. What I noticed, as I'm sure all of you that were teaching at that time noticed as well, is that student engagement was low. Students' adjustment to college life was poor. And so I was trying to find some way to engage with my students. Lecture was not going to cut it because of the format of the lecture. And like I said, I've had these different versions of the course that I needed to kind of stay within. And so I developed a book club. This book club, it started out rather small, and it actually started with the book I have in the middle, Aaron Brockovich's Superman's Not Coming. I did that over Zoom with a small group of students, and it was fine, but it was more technical or more dense content than what I was looking for. I was just looking for a book that I could use as a way to connect with students that was related to our course concepts. So for the past, I'd say 3 years or so now, I've been using Clara and the Sun, which is a fiction book. It was I believe it was a New York Times bestseller, a well-known author, and it's an easy read for students, but it ties into the course concepts. So I started running this by myself, but it grew so large that I had to enlist the help of undergraduate teaching assistants, which is a program that our School of Engineering has to help train undergraduates to, be teachers, and to support our courses for active learning or, freshman engagement. So this is a perfect fit for them. So now I have students come in, they break into small groups with 2 undergraduate teaching assistants. They talk about, the book. They talk about how it relates to the course. They talk about what courses to register for next semester. So it's given the students a way to connect with sort of like a peer mentor, someone who's just a couple years ahead of them, and connect with each other in small groups. So that's been very successful. The undergraduate students, or undergraduate TAs, also asked if they could start a Discord channel. So that's for them to run without me. And that's a good way for students to ask questions that they might not want to ask me, or complain about the course in a way that they don't want to complain directly to me. And so I'll get some feedback from my UGTAs, but it's, more, once again, for those UGTAs to mentor students and build a community outside of me. So I've been using Claire and the Sun. It's a great book because it's just, a talking point for us. And then I also have a picture of a third book, Bill Gates's How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So I use this in one of my classes. I think it's a great book for talking about climate change and, what tangible things we need to be working on right now. But I could not use that or Claire and the Sun for my open access course because we cannot require any paid things. So instead of using the full book, I found an interview of Gates talking about this book, and I can assign that free YouTube video to students. They watch that, and then we come together and we discuss it. So for that large online class, I've had students tell me that this is the first time that they've had an instructor organize something to talk together. It's a great way for them to connect, especially those non-traditional students that are doing all their courses online. So those are ways that I've tried to really foster engagement with me, but also foster engagement with each other in that class in particular. Next, I want to talk about what happens when your, administration changes the support that they're willing to give to you, and also COVID hits. So, in that fall or that spring 2020, when I was starting to teach, I was teaching this course, CE 361, Introduction to Environmental Engineering for Civil Engineers. And I inherited this course. It had a lab TA and a recitation TA, but I could kind of tell that things were shifting and I was going to lose my recitation TA. So I was looking at my course, and I had the course set up as 2 lectures a week, and then on Friday students would do recitation or lab. And they would switch, depending upon, what their schedule was. And so I always had my lab TA and my recitation TA working on Fridays. So I knew I was going to lose that recitation spot, But I also saw that recitations and, interacting with students, that active learning was very, very important. So I looked at what material I wanted to cover in my course. And what I did was I thought about the context of that I was putting into my lectures, where I was trying to explain why certain things were important. Why do we care about, strong acids? Why do we care about water pollution? And so I took some of that context and I moved it to pre-lecture assignments, what I call my asynchronous assignments. So by taking some material out of my lectures, assigning it to students ahead of time, I could focus my first lecture period on the technical material, and then my second lecture period became my recitation. I once again enlisted the help of a UGTA. And I was able to kind of even build better connections with my students because the UGTA and I were handling recitation together. I could tell what subjects, what topics students were struggling with, and address that with the whole group all at once right then, or address students one-on-one. So it was a great way to kind of reinforce why this class matters, and also get better, support for students with engaging them better in the classroom. Other changes that I made in this course on the next slide, oh, no, sorry, I didn't know my own slides. This is, no, so go, I'll talk about this. So this is an example of one of my asynchronous assignments ahead of time. So I have students look up, what is Superfund? What does it mean? Does a site qualify or to be a Superfund site, and what are some drawbacks of that? And then I have them look up a Superfund site in their community. There are several benefits to this. Number one is that they see that environmental pollution is a problem all around them. So they might not realize that, a couple miles down the road from where they grew up, there was a Superfund site. So it kind of reinforces the value of environmental engineering. Second is they have to make a post and they respond to their classmates. So they are learning about, where their classmates are from or what's important to their classmates. So it enhances class relationships that way. And then the third one is, this is a good example where a student looked into a steel production facility. So my students, most of them are in my civil engineering class and not not interested in environmental engineering. If they loved environmental engineering, they probably would be environmental engineering majors because we have that as a separate major at ASU. So they don't love my course. They're doing it because they have to, but I can use an assignment like this to teach them the value of, environmental engineering and how, for example, steel production has environmental consequences. Another example on the next slide is a synchronous assignment looking at social and environmental justice. So I try to frame this broadly, that that environmental justice happens in all different types of pollution: air, water, solid waste. I also frame it broadly in that it impacts different populations, rural, urban, and different racial groups as well. So given lots of options of this is all real stuff, choose something, write about it. And then what I make sure that I do is talk about how this is, I ask them to reflect on how this is going to relate to their future career, which the reality is, for some crazy reason, it's not going to be in environmental engineering. So, so these are ways that I try to kind of build buy-in to my course for students that don't necessarily want to be there. Next slide, I'm just going to skip over in the interest of time. I've also looked at in the same course of how to incorporate a little bit broader of problems in my lab courses. So I'm connecting the lab, the lecture, and kind of career application. So not just doing a jar test, doing a cost estimate for chemical costs for a water treatment plant, something they might do when they are in the consulting world. Next, and the final topic that I want to talk about that I've brought into my courses is field trips. So I've done this in some of my courses in my civil engineering class, my water treatment design course, and also in this research project we have funded by the EPA, where we are bringing together students to kind of train them for what the water workforce might look like. So I find that field trips are a great way to get students excited or get them to remember what they're learning in classes. I've been doing wastewater field trips every semester. Those are pretty easy for me to be able to organize. The water trips have been a lot more difficult because it's a lot more effort for the water plants to accommodate us. Um, so I kind of liken it to all of you that do research and you write a lot of research grants and you get rejected a lot, but you keep on going. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to places that could accommodate you for field trips. A lot of people will say no. And that's okay, just keep on going because it really is worth it for the students. With this EPA water workforce cohort, we're bringing together groups of students, getting them to hear consultant talks, go to some conferences, and a big part of it is going on field trips, which they love. So the next slide has some of the field trips that we were able to do in the spring. The first one is us in front of aluminum recycled material at a mixed recycling facility that is in our greater Phoenix area. It was a new facility. They were really excited to do field trips. Hopefully that they keep up with that. Below that is a picture of a surface water treatment plant. This is a basin that's used for pre-sedimentation, and I think it's out of service. A great way to connect what we're teaching in the course or what students are going to be looking at when they're consulting engineers, give them that exposure now. Then the fire truck picture I have is actually originally from the Transformers movie. And so this was a movie prop that was purchased by the Palo Verde nuclear power plant and is a really heavy duty power plant or a fire truck that you would need at a nuclear power plant. Last picture is our group in front of cooling towers, excuse me, for the Palo Verde nuclear power plant. These are 3 of their 9 cooling towers. This nuclear power plant is unique in that it is the only nuclear plant that is not co-located with a natural water source. And it's treated wastewater effluent from the city of Phoenix and surrounding cities that come into this plant for cooling water. So we in the Phoenix area can literally say that our wastewater, about a third of it evaporates into thin air because of this plant. So great experience for students. And this is something that we kind of had to put on hold during kind of COVID times, but it's coming back. And it's a great idea to kind of iterate, always think about what's working in our courses, what's not. And hopefully I've been able to give you some suggestions on, what you could potentially incorporate to make your classes a little bit more successful.
All right, thank you very much, Mackenzie. So let's go ahead and move to our third panelist. So Dr. Elliot Douglas is the department head and professor at Environmental Engineering Sciences within the University of Florida. So he's going to talk a little bit today kind of from the department level and just in a university setting, how do we think about SOAD a little bit more? So take it away.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'll try not to be too long. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, but you can go to the next slide. You've heard some examples and could potentially feel a bit overwhelming. Like, what do I do? Like, I'm interested in this, but like, there's so much. And so I want to just give you some simple ways to think about getting started. The first question is just simply, what do you want to know? Like, what do you notice about your students that interests you? Maybe, we've heard, engagement is an issue. So like, why are they less engaged? Or I'm going to try something to see if I can get them more engaged in the class. Does it work? Maybe you're making a change in your class, or someone has said, "Oh, you should try a flipped class." And you're like, "Yeah, but how do I know if that's going to actually make any difference or not?" And so those are the kinds of questions you just might ask, just sort of like, what interests you? That's kind of how I started. So just to give a quick background, and actually I'll point out, my career almost exactly matches Angie's. Like, we started the same year at different universities. I think I went to the same workshop as her. I think the year before is when I went. And so sort of we've kind of like paralleled along the way. So that's the first thing. So I started with that. I was like, is this technique that I'm using working? Then the next question is, how do you measure that? So, is this something that can be measured with grades? Like, I want to know if the students are doing better as a result of using a flipped classroom. Well, there's a grade question. Is there some kind of survey you can use, or maybe you have to write your own survey? So like engagement, maybe you can find a survey out there, as Angie mentioned, that's like is about engagement, and you can ask them questions. Or does it require qualitative data? Qualitative data is textual. So we talk about grades or surveys as being numbers. Even a survey that's on a Likert scale, like a 1 to 5 kind of scale, that's a number. But sometimes you might want to do qualitative data, like a written text box on your survey, or even going to the point of like asking, doing a little interview with them. Qualitative data is great for answering questions of why. So you might get some, and actually this happened to me. I got some results on critical thinking that were really strange. I was like, well, why is that? And then someone suggested to me, oh, you could do a little qualitative study and ask them about like what happened during the survey when they did it. And I got some good answers from that. And then the next question is, what guidance do you need? Because you're starting with this, you're going to probably, want some kind of mentorship or something like that. So some places you can look. Do you have a Department of Engineering Education or an engineering education program on campus? We have one here at UF. Angie has one. ASU, there is one, but you may not. Maybe you go to the College of Education. That's what I did, actually. I wanted to learn more about qualitative research. I found somebody at UF who does qualitative research. And actually, I walked one of the bullets there is network at conferences. I actually found her a talk she was at a conference I was at. And I walked up to her after her talk and introduced myself. And I think she thought I was crazy as an engineer wanting to learn about qualitative research. But we became good collaborators, and I learned a lot. You may know people who are doing SOTL, including the people on this panel. They're going to share our emails with us, so do that. And then Zinu mentioned the REEF program and also BISCR. These are programs in which you can get funding to do a little project and at the same time get mentored by an expert in that area. And I've done that. I've served as a mentor for projects within the REEF program. And it's a great way to start to learn how to do this kind of research. And so once you do the project, so I've skipped over all the pieces about how to do the project. Should you collect data first or look in the literature first? I'm always an advocate of like, let's actually like get something to start with, and then you can start thinking about the literature and what it means. But you may just be interested in gathering some data. So there's a bunch of journals, and you mentioned a few of them, but I've got just a list here. I'm not going to go through the list. Some of them are general SOTL types of journals, and some of them are, as you can see, are maybe more aligned with environmental engineering. Unfortunately, there's no Journal of Environmental Engineering Education, but the civil engineering and chemical engineering ones may fit the bill. And then if you think about conferences, again, Zin, you mentioned some conferences. There's a couple that are SOTL, general SOTL conferences. And then, of course, there's the education sections at AESP, and ASEE does the work. And so when you think about ASEE, if you go to the next slide, there's a couple different options. So there's the annual conference that Angie mentioned annually in June. One of the things to note, there's like almost 60 different divisions. Some of them are more engineering education research oriented, and some are more SOTL oriented. And so I've tried to list at least some of the ones that are more SOTL oriented and more aligned with environmental engineering here, or perhaps a topic that you're working in. And the process is you submit an abstract, the abstract gets accepted, then you write a draft paper, and there's a review of it. And so it is actually a peer-reviewed conference paper, so there is some weight to it in that way. AC also runs, as was mentioned, these smaller section conferences. These are regional. And so they might be a little more accessible to you because they might be more local to you. And so on the next slide, I think I've got the various zones and sections. So there's 4 zones, and each zone consists of 3 sections. And so there might be a zone or a section conference. So you can take a quick look at this map and find your state, and figure out what section you're in, and then look for the section or the zone conference that you're in. Those tend to be more practitioner related, practitioner being like educator related. So a lot of people talking about the kinds of things they're doing in the classroom rather than the more, theoretical or foundational engineering education research kind of work. So as a beginner in this area, they might be more accessible to you. Now I want to talk about it from sort of what is the benefits of doing this? And I'm trying to give you a chair's perspective. And I've broken it down into the 3 areas that we typically consider for tenure and promotion: teaching, research, and service. So we've already heard a lot about the benefits for teaching. It provides data for class improvement. You can better support student learning. Teaching evaluations, here at Florida, the only real thing in the tenure promotion packet that is looked at for teaching is, for the most part, is evaluations. And you also talk about the things you've done in the classroom and how you've done teaching, but they really focus on teaching evaluations. So it's a way to, improve your teaching practices so that you can improve your teaching evaluations. And then if you have some kind of teaching portfolio, perhaps as part of your package, then you can provide that as input to your teaching portfolio. From the research perspective, it can add on to your research metrics, such as publications and conference presentations. As I mentioned, the conference papers are peer-reviewed. At ASCE, the national conference, it's about a 60% acceptance rate from abstract to publication. It depends on the particular division, but it's about that. And obviously, if you do some SOTL work, that can provide preliminary data for proposals. Like, you're going to submit one of these REEF proposals, it's great to have that preliminary data as a piece to put into that proposal. And then just in terms of service, it's a great community with professional service opportunities. I've been very active in the ASCE divisions and ASCE government. I will say that it's a very welcoming and open community. Within ASCE, I found different that you might find, I've noticed in some engineering areas, everyone's like kind of jealously guards their research, and it's proprietary and they don't want to share because they don't want to get scooped or something like that. Very different in engineering, and that's not true across all, but I have seen that. But it's very different in engineering education. It's very open and welcome, and people willing to share. But there are some caveats to thinking about doing this and how it might affect your tenure and promotion pathway. So the main thing is, does the culture on your campus or in your department support SOTL as a scholarly endeavor? You heard from Angie, her experience where it didn't really count until she kind of educated her faculty. And you'll see that. I ran into that too in a previous department that I was in, where honestly, I was not going to be, they essentially turned down my promotion to full professor because they pretty much discounted my engineering education work. So you have to kind of, navigate that a little bit. Some of that may be, are you at a high research institution? And what do they think about engineering education as an endeavor versus maybe at a primarily undergraduate institution, where there might be a different emphasis on the scholarly aspects of education. So again, you just kind of have to feel things out and understand the environment you're in. And as part of that, how are conference papers viewed as scholarly output? I've seen in some cases where even though the ASCE papers are peer-reviewed, especially at a place like an R1 institution, despite the fact that they're peer-reviewed and it's, the 60% acceptance rate, it's still sometimes considered not as valuable as a journal publication and kind of discounted a little bit. So again, those are all things to scope out. Not saying, I don't want to discourage anybody from it. Doing SOTL can be a very personally rewarding activity. And I think there's just a lot of benefit from thinking about it that way. How you manage your time on these different things depends. Also, it depends your position. Are you tenure track, or are you in a position? I think Mackenzie, you're more on a teaching kind of a track, right? So that might make a difference in terms of how you support, what you kind of do. And I want to stop there so we have some time for questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Elliot. That was a great end to our presentations. So I think we can probably now open it up for the Q&A. I don't actually think I have the Q&A box opened up for myself, so I don't know if there's anything in there quite yet.
There is one a question for
Mhm.
me.
Uh-huh.
Lee Yuan asked, I have a question for Mackenzie. We know that during COVID, engagement from online students was generally low. What do you think about online programs where students mainly want the certification, prefer minimal engagement with instructors or teaching fellows? Should the engagement strategies be different for these type of online programs or for these students? So I think that we have a very wide range of students. So there are these non-traditional students that are trying to get an online degree, and if not being engaged with me in that large class, it meets their needs because they need to get through that course material and that's all they want, I'm fine with that. They have different needs than the 17, 18-year-old student who tried to come to college and is sitting in a dorm room listening to all their lectures over Zoom. So I think there's no like one size fits all approach here. I think you really have to be in touch with what your students need and kind of cater to that. And then another thing I would say is like we have a limited time, we have limited resources. Where do we want to put our effort towards? So if somebody doesn't need our help, is okay with the way things are, maybe we don't spend extra time getting them to participate in this extra thing. Maybe we spend that other time engaging with the students that we find are struggling or are want to build more of a community. So I think it's just being aware of different student needs and adjusting accordingly.
Very nice. Thank you, Mackenzie. And I guess just to move on, or not move on, but continue this discussion a bit, I wanted to, something that I've been thinking about, I guess I want to ask during this is, as a new professor thinking about these things, how do you kind of understand and appreciate kind of whether or not something is just a one semester thing? Like the sample size, right, for me is just one semester of teaching. So how do you understand kind of if it's just that cohort versus if you should try and implement changes? Like, I guess I'm trying to think about the baseline that we have versus when you make the change, how do you see if it's effective or not? So I guess I'm curious just to hear from you all how you've gauged that in terms of how you evaluate whether or not something's effective or not.
I think the rule of thumb that I've got from other people, Matt, in our department is you got to teach a course 3 times before you start to feel like you know what's going on and you can kind of flesh out whether or not it's a you problem or a them problem or whatever. I think once again, for our department, there are certain groups of students that are known to have certain general characteristics. So checking in with your colleagues about that is helpful. And I think also just trying to, once again, trying to understand the needs of each different student. Is it a student who doesn't really care too much, not too engaged, and so their complaints about the high workload, you might not, react to as much versus another student that might, be really trying hard, doing all the right things, and then they're, failing all their exams. So I think you got to be patient with this process, but also just kind of look at individual students and just kind of feel the vibes, I guess.
Nice. Thank you, Mackenzie. Elliot or Angie, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the social aspect of it, that's why you maybe saw that someone else tried something really similar and it worked, but then your context is different, right? So if you're going to be publishing it, you're going to talk about your specific context, and it kind of relates to one of the questions that I just saw in the chat. So ethics or sustainability, or maybe I think Mackenzie mentioned social justice, like what is your institutional context and language around those? Like your entire institution might have all students meeting a sustainability learning outcome, for example. And so then that's consistent across your institution, but maybe you're at a different place where they're heavily supported by oil and gas money, and they they want a different sort of slant on those things. So I think I find that every institution is different, and every year, right? Every year the class seems to be different. Like what's going on in the world? What is the local news, national news talking about can change how students perceive some of these topics. So yeah, to me, every year is a new gain. And what Mackenzie said, like being really kind of sensitive to pick up on those cues from students. If, you know, for some of the topics that I'm teaching, ethics, sustainability, et cetera, it's not like you're running an equation and there's one right answer, right? So to indicate that to students that we're open to discussion, this is gray area, and you should feel comfortable sharing your thoughts and engaging in a discussion versus like, no, you're wrong. Like I would never say that to a student around those topics. And they need to feel comfortable pushing back on me or pushing back on others, as long as it's a civil discourse, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just agree with Angie on that one. I teach an ethics class for environmental engineering, and that's exactly what we try to do. And it's an open discussion class, and different things come out. And we do have those very opposite viewpoints. I mean, I just think back last spring we had somehow, I think because of an example I gave, we had a discussion about working for a military contractor. And would you? And one student said, absolutely no, never. And another student at the other end extreme said, yeah, I mean, I'm just doing the engineering, and like, I'm not the one deciding how these things are going to be used. And, we can debate the ethics of that. And we kind of did a little bit, but everyone was respectful and was able to have that open discussion. I don't know if we want to get into the politics of it, but but that's an issue right now, right? And I think that goes to it, right? So when I have this class, I open up to multiple perspectives so that students can see things in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, the multiple perspectives, having different ways of students kind of engaging, as we learned about with all the topics, actually kind of thinking about just how do we fit the local context for each thing. And Mackenzie, I think you mentioned at one point kind of AI and how it's impacting things. I guess I'm curious just to hear an input. I mean, we hear about AI so frequently, so often. How do you all think it's impacting kind of the way we engage students, assess students, and things like that in this realm, I guess, of the social nature?
So I'll say that social and environmental justice assignment, last semester I assigned it, and we estimate that about 20% of the class cheated on an ethics assignment and had AI write it. So I was mad, and I had them all kind of rewrite the assignment in class and gave them a stern talking to or whatever, but there wasn't much more I could do because it was the beginning of the semester. I didn't want to alienate all my students. I think in engineering, it's a little bit easier because we can still have in-class exams. But for like that sustainability freshman level class, I have to do these certain assessments for ASU, and I can't do it as a multiple choice or whatever. It has to be a written thing, but I also can't do it outside the classroom. So it's been hard to adjust. And so I think, and this is very similar to like, how do you get students to engage? Well, spend the effort where there are students that want to engage. How do you get students to not cheat, or in particular, how do you get students to learn in your class? Can we focus on, like, if I spend all my time trying to police this AI usage, I will have no time to focus on the students that are doing things right. So there are certain flags that I use. And usually it's like, if you get flagged, you have to come in and talk to me and explain your work. They could potentially have used AI that first time, but when they come in to talk to me, they know they have to learn that material and do that material. And then they, in the end, learned. So it's really tough. I'm so glad that I, teach technical classes where I can keep this out of my exam periods, but it's really tough.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's, I think, very good insights, just thinking about kind of how we move forward, right?
Let me add something about
Mhm.
AI from like you said, a subtle perspective or a research perspective. there could be, and there's to talk about how we might use AI to analyze data, particularly when I mentioned that qualitative data, right? There might be a temptation to like, take all the answers from the students and copy them into ChatGPT and say, ChatGPT, give me the main themes that you see. And I want to caution you against doing that. For one thing, it could very easily violate your IRB requirements. ChatGPT is not confidential. And part of the IRB requirements is this data has to remain confidential, essentially. And so you should not be putting it into ChatGPT. That's just a thing. And the other thing is, I wouldn't just take those results as given because you don't know exactly how it's sorting things. The human piece really does need to be there. So we've used some AI tools for qualitative analysis, but it's always been like a back and forth between what the AI shows us and then going back and looking at the data and seeing like, okay, does this really make sense, or did the AI like make something up somehow?
Great. Yes. Thanks. I think another very interesting point just to think about, right? How we use AI to try and improve things. So I think we're a bit past the hour, so I understand if people need to stop popping off. I think we can probably remain in the Q&A session for a little bit if we have other questions that we want to talk about.
Matt, I think we should answer the question about the first step one that's on the question list. So for those of us who are new to Soto, what's the realistic first project or way that to start, and what's the biggest challenges getting started?
Yeah, to me, it's unique to each person's local context, right? So there's probably a course where you're curious, either something, why are students cheating using AI? Or you've gotten to the end of the semester, why didn't they learn it? Or in some cases too, it's what's changed over time, right? Like in previous years, this assignment has gone great. I get high quality responses. This year, not. What happened there, right? So you'll start with a question that's unique to your own specific course or context. And then, depending on what that question is, you can think about how to answer it. Like, again, what might have other people encountered this? What's out in the literature? Like, that's where I usually start. Is I see a problem. Am I just missing something that's obvious that everyone else probably knows and has been talking about? So when I started doing community engagement and senior capstone, it's like, oh, well, outside of engineering, people have been doing what's called service learning, and that's got a 50-year history that I just didn't know about, right? So it's like, oh, cool, like I need to educate myself. Or you may have something brand new and you do poke around. It's like, wow, no one has looked at this. And, start small. What evidence might you already have through assignments? Anecdotal, could you talk to one of your TAs or course assistants? What have they seen? And then that could allow you to then think of opportunities to get more direct data. But it can be a slow building, process.
Thank you. I also want to ask our panelists, what data evidence you feel like most persuasive for you when you are doing your SOTO work?
I'm going to just build on what Angie just said and say it depends, right? The key is, as Angie said, what are you trying to figure out, right? And so, and just make sure it matches, right? If I'm trying to learn about like engagement, right? Why are students more or less engaged? Then I probably aren't, and probably their grades in the course aren't going to be particularly useful. Right. On the other hand, if I want to know, like, hey, something about like, did they learn this stuff? Then yeah, then grades would be useful. So I think you just have to look carefully at what you want to know and then match your evidence to what you want to know.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about those departmental culture and the different institution things can be different. I wonder whether you can also, all of you can give suggestions. If you are working in an institution, you feel like the culture was not there to support SOTO yet. How do we craft the collaboration or the culture change to be more supportive, acceptable about the SOTO work?
I think you need to find your people. So, ASU is very big. And so when there are certain areas that I'm working in and like, for example, that environmental justice, first time I gave that assignment, I got some really awful responses from students like, how dare you put this in an engineering curriculum? This is ridiculous. And I was like, oh, that hurt. But I talked to my supervisor. He connected me with some people who work in that area and um, and validated the work that I was doing. Made me realize that this was a good assignment to have. So that was good. The different conferences that have been mentioned here. Elliot just going up to somebody and saying, "Hey, I like your work," or whatever. Just building a network, just like we do with traditional lab research or something like that.
Yeah, culture change is hard and slow, as many of you probably know. So, of course, Mackenzie's suggestion is great. Like, you need support so you're not all alone. And sometimes that support can even be outside your institution. That's where I started. My collaborators were not at CU. And so that at least was motivating internally. And then sometimes it's figuring out the external reward structure. It's kind of like an oh well or not. But if you're in the promotion and tenure ranks, I think you can definitely once your package is up to the level of external letters, if you do work in this area, at least at my school, we got to put up some names and you would describe why. So you would say, my disciplinary work is in this area, but I've also done SOTL work or engineering education research, and here's some people who can speak to that. And so you can see, like Ellie and myself, like most of the external review letters I get asked to right now are talking about their engineering education research. And I spend time in my letter to first describe what this area even is, knowing that people in their local department may not know that. You may be the only one in your environmental or civil engineering department who does significant amount of this work. So you might feel isolated there, but that first step in your package, at least at our institution, is very, very critical. So there are people in our discipline around the country who do this work, and most of us are supportive of our community and are going to take the time to write those letters and explain what is our discipline to those who aren't familiar with it.
Thank you, both Mackenzie and Angela and Elliot, for the great panel presentation and the discussion. I also want to point out, Elliot mentioned all the panelists and also the moderators today in this webinar are your first step resources. If you want, feel free to reach out to us. Our email contact is on the screen. And if you want more conversation, ask for any materials to share, feel free to reach out. I would like to thank all our panelists again. Thank you very much for your time. And this wrap out our webinar today. Thank you very much for your attending.